Welcome back to another episode of The Shadows of Jesus. And today I'm joined by the one and only
Kellie Austin.
Kellie Austin. Kellie, you've been around Redeemer for a while. We're in an interim position.
Yeah.
Now all of a sudden you're full time. You're on staff.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell our listeners before we jump into Luke, just tell us a little bit about what does Kellie do at or around Redeemer?
Yeah. So really happy to be on staff, by the way. But I am the church life director. So basically I handle Sunday teams. I do assimilation, which is just a big word for helping people go through the process of becoming a partner and like anything from visitor to partner at Redeemer. Yeah. And then I'm just here for like the highs and lows for people. So if you're going through something, I'll meet with you and pray with you, grab a cup of coffee. But I'm here for all the goods and the bads.
Yeah, love it. We're thankful to have you. So
it's been fun.
And now you I was like, anybody want to be on the podcast this week? And you're like, I'll do it.
First podcast,
First podcast ever. Thanks for stepping in. All right, so today we're going to recap Luke. We've already talked about Matthew, Mark, and John. So you ready for Luke?
Yep, ready.
Let's do it. All right, so of the Gospels, Mark, most likely the first one written.
Yep.
So it's short, it's quick hitting. You see the word immediately. It flies. Then Matthew and Luke come around, and so most scholars would say that they had a source document. It's like if you're doing like a works cited, that Mark was one of their sources. They're like, hey, what did Mark write? And so they would be citing it and quoting it if necessary, if they had to back in the day for not to plagiarize. But what they do is they take Mark's stuff where he's quick and concise, and they expand and give more details. And Luke is the one who goes into the most detail, because he's kind of like an investigative reporter.
Okay.
So it's kind of cool. Like, so it's a good book for those who need more details, because maybe they have more questions or want to know, like, well, what about this? What about that? What about this? All right. So let's just kick it off by looking at the first 4 verses and unpack this a little bit. So first 4 verses of Luke. Why don't you read verses 1 and 2 for me?
Yeah. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who have the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us.
Great. Yeah. So in short, Luke is basically saying, hey, I know other eyewitnesses like Mark and Matthew have already written on this. You've read them. So most likely Theophilus, who he's writing to, has already read a gospel, probably Mark, maybe even Matthew. He's like, I know you've already read them. He's like, but like, you've got this basic understanding, and I want to expand upon that. Before we move on to verses 3 and 4, like I want to point out something real quick. Whenever I study the Bible, like I do you underline?
Yeah,
like
all the time.
I underline, I circle, I box.
Yep, that's what I do.
Bracket, different things. And sometimes I don't even know what it means. I'm just like, I feel like I need to do something here. But I would be like, circle the word accomplished if I was leading a Bible study or in my own Bible, because that word means fulfilled. And so what it's saying is, he's like, I want to give an orderly account of how Jesus has fulfilled all this stuff in the Old Testament. So basically, all this stuff in the Old Testament has been pointing towards Jesus, which is the whole point of this podcast.
Yeah.
It's like when we went to the Old Testament, it's like, hey, it's all pointing us to Jesus. And how Luke is like the guy who's saying, like, I really want to help connect those dots. So Luke is really the better Shadows of Jesus podcast.
Luke's the new host.
Yeah, he's the new. I'm going to get Luke on the show next week. Anyway, so verses 3 and 4. Read 3 and 4 for me.
It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things that have been taught. Do we know who that is? Theophilus?
Theophilus?
Yeah.
That's a great question. Like, no one knows who he is.
Yeah, what a weird name.
You're like, who was Theophilus? But a lot of commentators think he probably funded this project. And so like I said, Luke's kind of like an investigative reporter. So if you're like, and Jesus came from the east, he would go to the place and be like, so Jesus came from the west, right? Like, just trying to like figure out, like, no, he said like he's the east. Like, okay, this is consistent. Everyone has literally said he came from the east. Like but to think about that, to go interview people, to go gather data, to collect stories, like different towns, he's getting to hotel rooms, like all these types of things cost money. And so most likely Theophilus is probably the guy who's like, hey, like, what money do you need to go investigate this stuff and to figure it out. So I'll bankroll it. I'll pay for it. And so he writes this letter to Theophilus, who's most likely bankrolling the project of both Luke. And do you know what Luke part 2 is?
What?
Acts. And so
I like that.
Yeah. So Acts is actually the same. It's also written to Theophilus.
Oh, cool.
So same guy. Anyways, yeah, most likely he's the guy who's just funding the work of Luke to go and investigate the claims around Jesus.
Oh, very cool.
Here's what I love about these verses. Luke, like I said, he was a skeptic. He didn't just blindly believe the gospel accounts he read. He wrestled with them, or he followed them. He followed all things closely for some time. Like that's a fancy way of saying like, man, I've wrestled with this stuff for a while. But after doing his investigative work, he moves from being a skeptic to being someone who has one of the most dynamic faiths we see in Scripture. So if you read 2 Timothy, Paul is basically saying, he's like, everybody is abandoning me. Like at this point, like to associate with Paul is like, you're going to get beat up or spit at or lose business. Like he's not a guy you want to be friends with if you want to advance in the world. And so everyone's leaving him and he's like, but Luke. And so in the midst of the hardest time of Paul's life, Luke is the guy who stands by his side. So he goes like skeptic faith. I'm not even sure this is real to like, I'm so convinced this is real that I know it's worth losing anything. Yeah. So I just love seeing like how it's okay to wrestle with questions. And sometimes when you have questions or you feel skeptical about your faith, it's the wrestling with those questions that can sometimes ground you deeper. Oh yeah. And so I'm a big proponent of, if you have questions, like don't be scared to ask them. It's okay to have iffy faith. It's okay to have uncertainty in your faith, like these seasons, because oftentimes it's the wrestling with it is what moves you from the shaky ground to the more solid ground. So that's awesome. That's a cool thing in those first 4 verses, just seeing Luke writing from a skeptic's position, but then saying, but like I went from skeptic to certain because of the work that I did. So,
yeah, that's awesome.
Right. So chapters 1 and 2. After verse 4, the rest of chapter 1 and chapter 2, it gives us the most details about Jesus's childhood. So we get some stories in there. We also have some cool songs where Mary sings. Sounds a lot like some songs we heard in the Old Testament. But Matthew tells us about his birth, and then he just kind of fast forwards 30 years. Yeah. Mark just starts at year 30. He's like, and Jesus got baptized. But Luke's like, let's talk about some childhood stories. Any childhood stories stand out to you in Luke?
The fact that Jesus like runs off basically, and like Mary and Joseph are like, wait, where did Jesus go? Yeah. And he's like out teaching, he's not even like doing anything bad, or anything like that, because he's Jesus, but like he's just gone, and he's like, they find him in a temple later.
Yeah, he's like teaching all these like religious leaders. Yeah. They're like, who's this kid? He knows a lot. Yeah. He was definitely smarter than a 5th grader.
Definitely.
Yeah, I remember like wrestling with that. I'm like, how did he get lost? And it turns out, like, families, there are pilgrimage trips that it would take to Jerusalem every year. Yeah. And a lot of times you like travel as a like your whole family. So like, so imagine like you and your family and like 2 other families that you grew up with are really close, and you guys take a road trip. You're at the gas station, Buc-ee's. Yeah. And you're getting your food, and then afterwards, like, hey, can we switch cars? Because kids all the time. And so imagine like they're like, yeah, Kelly's gonna be in the van, and then they hop in their car and they cruise on. Then you get to the next gas station. It's like,
wait, where's she at?
Was Kelly not in the van? It's like they kind of just trusted that she was probably with other family, other friends. Yeah. And so they get pretty far off and like, where's Jesus? They've got to then travel back, and they find him, and he's just stumping people with his incredible teaching. So, which
is insane, just to think of like that many people like gathering around, like listening to him, like these teachers Jesus. Who are like actively teaching all the time. And it's like 12-year-old Jesus.
Yeah. My daughter's 12. Like,
he's that youth kid that ran off,
so he's like, and there's also thing like, it says Jesus, he grew in wisdom and stature, but he was a kid. He had to grow. Yeah. Like, so this means Jesus is like a 6th grader right now. Wow. Like you went bowling with the youth last weekend, and you're with Maverick. Like he's like, imagine Jesus as Maverick.
It's insane to think about, like just someone so young, it's wild.
So there's some smart 6th graders, but not Jesus, but not Jesus smart. That's a great story. So then we get to chapters 3 through just kind of the first part of 4. We'll call it chapter 3 to 4a. So after Jesus' childhood, we get to the beginning of his ministry. And in chapter 3, we have standard stuff that we see in other gospels. John the Baptist prepares the way. Jesus gets baptized. And then what are we given?
The genealogy, all the names.
Yeah. So then this kind of leads to one of the questions that came in this week.
Yeah. They said, why are the genealogies in Matthew and Luke different? Is this a contradiction that proves the Bible is unreliable?
All right. So I remember hearing this in college and being like, and so my old school study Bible, who knows if it was right or not, but it sounded good. It said some people believe Matthew's genealogy connects Jesus to David through Joseph. So it's like his adoptive father. Which would have been legally his real father, basically connects him to King David. And then Luke's genealogy connects Jesus to David, but does so not through his adoptive father, but through his biological mother, Mary. And so you see different names because it's tracing different parents to show. So whether it's his adoptive father or his biological mom, both sides lead him as an heir or in the line of David. So that's one possibility. But I think that the biggest difference that we don't want to miss in the genealogy is Matthew ends at Father Abraham. Had many sons. And Luke goes beyond that and gets all the way, not to Abraham, but all the way back to who?
Adam.
To Adam. All right. And so with that, what we see is that Luke wants us to understand that Jesus didn't come just to redeem Israel. He came to be the hope of the world.
Oh, wow.
To all humanity. So here's something I saw for the very first time. This is why I love like reading the Bible over and over and over again, because you keep learning new stuff. So it's like, well, I already read this. It's like, I didn't see that before. So here's a question. What caused the world to fall apart in Genesis 3?
Adam and Eve falling into temptation.
Okay. So another question. Does the placement of the genealogy feel a little weird? The fact that it comes this deep into the book?
Oh, yeah. Why doesn't it come before, like in Matthew?
Yeah, Matthew's like straight off.
Yeah.
Like in the genealogy, and then Jesus was born. It's like, it feels like it should be earlier.
Before.
Okay. So the placement is strategic because a genealogy is more than just here's your family tree. It's kind of like a resume, and it's telling us about who Jesus is and what Jesus came to do. And so if there were no verses or no chapter breaks, like we added those things later. I think chapters came in the 1500s, verses in the 1700s. But if we didn't have that stuff, immediately after the genealogy, what happens in Luke?
Jesus goes into the wilderness to be tempted.
Yeah. So Luke goes beyond Abraham back to...
he goes back all the way back to Adam.
To Adam. Okay. And then Adam fell into temptation. And immediately after the genealogy showing that Jesus is going to be a better Adam, Jesus goes to be tempted. And where Adam failed, Jesus succeeds because he's the true and better Adam.
That's awesome.
So it's like it's really strategically placed. Like, so the genealogy is meant to show us how Jesus is going to be a better Adam.
Yeah.
And then immediately following Jesus being a better Adam, we have another temptation story, and where Adam failed, Jesus is successful. So I love like the arrangement of that, and how like I'm 39 years old, gave my life to Christ when I was like 8. Never seen that one before.
Yeah, no, I hadn't noticed that either. Like, just like, I mean, I noticed that it was in a different place, but I hadn't like thought about the like full picture.
So from here, Jesus goes to a synagogue. He opens up to Isaiah 61 and reads it. And he basically says like, this is all about me. And in verse 22, everyone marvels. But verse 28, the tone completely changes and everyone's outraged and they want to kill him.
So what caused that change of tone? Like, what was it about his words that were so offensive?
Yeah, it's like marveled to kill him.
Yeah. It's like drastic.
It's a drastic change. All right. So I think this one of the questions that came in was like, why do we need 4 gospels? It just feels redundant. I think it's literally the most important historical figure ever. Yep. I mean, there's more paintings of Jesus, more songs written about Jesus, more books written about Jesus than any other historical figure in the world. And it's like, if he's the most important historical figure ever, like it'd feel really anemic to only have one.
Yeah.
So, but they all serve different purposes, and we could get into more details about that. But Matthew is really about the expansion or the growth of the kingdom. So when you read those parables, you're going to see the mustard seed. You're going to see the seeds being thrown out on the different paths, but like a lot about growth, kingdom growth. So Matthew wants to show us how God's kingdom is growing and expanding into the world. Mark's gospel is really about being prepared to enter God's kingdom, which to be prepared to enter, you got to be cleansed.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of unclean things. Like you get the unclean food, and like God cares more about the cleansing of your heart. You have so a lot of cleansing stuff, a lot of preparing us. And Luke is really about how do we get into the kingdom. And so like the kind of the kingdom things, advance the kingdom, prepare for the kingdom. How do you get in?
Yeah.
And what he wants to show us is that we don't get in through our bloodline or being Jewish. We get in through faith. So there's a lot of awesome faith stories in Luke. Like the centurion is like, I tell you, in all of Israel, I haven't seen any faith like this guy. So you'll see it so it kind of opens up when you start reading Luke and seeing all the faith. It's like every time it mentions faith, it's showing us entrance into the kingdom is not through your bloodline, not through being Jewish, but through your faith. All right. So with that in mind, read like that Jesus is changing the perspective that entrance to the kingdom is not bloodline, but
through faith.
Faith. Read verses 24 and 26.
And he said, truly I say to you, no prophet is acceptable in his hometown. But in truth I tell you, there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heavens were shut up 3 years and 6 months, and a great famine came over all the land. And Elijah was sent to none of them, but only Zarephath, in the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow.
All right. So, and like I'll just like, Freedom, we can't say the names right.
Never. Doesn't matter how many times I look at them.
Like when we went through Job a couple years ago, I remember trying to say Leviathan. And, and I've like in my notes, I've been trying to like phonetically spell it out, and I still butchered it in the middle of the sermon. I was like, I just look like an idiot. Just say it with confidence. People are like, that's probably how you say it. Zarephath, Sidon.
Whatever it is.
All that to say.
Yeah.
Jesus is like, there were a lot of Jewish people hurting, right? A lot of people who were Jewish were hurting. And in the midst of all of them wanting help, God sent Elijah to a woman in Sidon or Sidon. And that is a place of non-Jews. So all these Jewish people hurting, and God's like, I'm going to pursue the non-Jew. Wow. So he reminds them of a story that would have been kind of like dug into their skin a little bit. Like, it's kind of, never really liked that part of the story. Right? Yeah. So read verse 27 real quick.
And there were many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed by only Naaman the Syrian.
Yeah, but only Naaman the Syrian.
Yeah.
Once again, lots of Jews had leprosy. Lots of Jews needed help, but God sent Elisha, Elijah's protege, to a non-Jew.
Wow.
Once again, like,
yeah,
didn't like that part of the story. Like he's like basically pointing out the details that are like, we just never really liked that part, like the non-Jewish part. And so Jesus is essentially pointing out that their Jewishness isn't the most important thing about them. When it comes to their right standing with God, it doesn't matter about your bloodline. And as he's pointing that out, it sets them off. And so Luke wants to stress in his gospel, like, hey, entering the kingdom, it's not about your Jewishness, right? Like God has always had a heart to pursue the non-Jews. Yeah. And so it's kind of what was showing like, hey, as I'm bringing about God's kingdom, as I'm fulfilling what the Old Testament is pointing to, it's going to result in the pursuit of those who are outside of the kingdom of Israel. And they're like, blasphemous, right? And what's crazy is like, do you remember what they tried to do after this?
No, what?
Like, so one is it's in Nazareth. Nazareth would have been about 500 people. Like, how big was your high school?
One, because I was homeschooled. I think that, I graduated with people, I think there was probably like 50 or 60, if that, small.
But my graduating class was like 680, you know, and so, but you 500s, you know Jesus.
Yeah.
Like this
is
everybody. A big town. And like, they're like, let's go throw them off a cliff. Like literally they're trying to cast them off a cliff. And the next time we see this idea of taking someone to a cliff and casting them out is actually, Jesus healing a demoniac. Yeah. And he throws the demons into the pigs, and the pigs go and jump
run
off the
into
cliff.
the ocean. Yeah.
And it's like, so basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to like an exorcism. It's like their response to Jesus is like, this dude must be demon possessed. It's like they're trying to exorcise Jesus in this moment, which is crazy. Right. And he just slips away. He's like, whoosh, which I love.
I gotta go.
Yeah. He's like, I'm out. All right, so that gets us to the back half of 4, all the way through the front end of chapter 9. And so once Jesus reveals his purpose, like, hey, I'm here to pursue those who need God. I'm here to bring people into the kingdom of God, which isn't about your Jewishness, but about your faith. He's like, all right, let's go start my ministry. But he begins what we would call his healing ministry. And so like some of the big things we see in these chapters are like, one, he's casting out demons. We see him cleanse a leper.
He heals the paralytic, heals the man with the withered hand.
He heals the centurion's son. He calms the storm.
Yeah, feeds the 5,000.
Yeah, and so this is something that I think I pointed this out in Mark. I just want to point it out again. Sometimes we think about these miraculous things happening, and we think of it as being a suspension of natural order. It's like, yeah, Jesus did a miracle, which isn't something that we can test and retest in a lab. It's an exception to that. That's why we call it a miracle, not Tuesday. But these are actually not a suspension of natural order as much as they are a restoration of natural order. Like in God's kingdom, like without sin, there's not supposed to be disease.
Yeah.
There's not supposed to be disaster. There's not supposed to be death. And so every miracle is ultimately kind of giving us a glimpse into what the kingdom as it expands and as the new heaven and earth come is meant to ultimately look like. A world without sin. Without sin is a world without disease, a world without disaster, a world without death. And so when we think about these miracles, I think it's helpful not to see them as much as a suspension of natural order, as much as a restoration of the order that was meant to be.
Yeah, I like that.
So all that to say, these miracles are showing a glimpse of him making all things new. And so Adam brings sin to the world. Jesus is taking sin out of the world. And so the big question comes, though, is like, how will Jesus redeem and restore the world which is fractured by sin? So it's kind of like, so we know like this is what Jesus is doing is kind of the question, but the question is like, well, how's he going to do this at a grander scale? How is he ultimately going to fulfill this? So chapter 9, verse 51, it's the hinge. Like that's what I wrote down in my Bible. I was like in the past when I read Luke, I wrote the hinge. Like this is where the book of Luke turns. But before we read verse 51, read verse 31 for me. Like, so this is at Jesus' transfiguration. Yeah. He's talking to Moses and Elijah, and he says they
spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem.
Yeah. So what's really cool is that word departure. Do you know what it means?
Exodus.
Yes. Like, so the word departure is the same word for Exodus. And so now with that being in mind, Exodus, read verse 51.
When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem.
All right, so here's what we see. He set his face. He's like, going. This is the hinge. He's like, now my eyes are like flint towards Jerusalem. Nothing's going to stop me. I'm journeying this way. God's people are enslaved to sin. And like Moses going into Egypt to rescue God's people, which was the Exodus.
Yeah.
Jesus is a better Moses. Like this is a bigger Exodus. He's going to Jerusalem to save God's people. But this time there won't be a slaughtered lamb with the blood displayed over the doorpost, the wooden doorpost for the Passover. There's going to be the blood of our Savior, Jesus, spread over a wooden cross. And so Jesus is not only the better Adam, he's also the better Moses. Yeah. And he's not just the better Moses, he's also the better Passover lamb. And so all of a sudden, John the Baptist's words, when he's like, behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world, it's like, oh, wow. Like this has a lot more depth to it when you're like, the lamb is slaughtered. Yeah. So that we can be saved. So that gets us to chapters 10 through 19. In chapters 10 through 19, Jesus begins his journey to Jerusalem. And there's some great stories in here. I mean, you got the Good Samaritan. That's a classic. There's the trilogy in chapter 15. So, like, what are the 3 stories in chapter 15? So you've got the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and then the prodigal son, of course. Yeah, we took a mission trip to Guatemala this summer, and so we're limited in songs that have been translated from English to Spanish. Yeah. But one of the songs that have been translated is the Reckless Love song. Oh, really? And so we put it on YouTube and just played it, and those kids, like passionately, like sang at the top of their lungs with all of their heart, to the point the team was like, we just kind of thought kids would sit there and be like, wins the song over.
Yeah.
But they were, and the youth minister there that actually came from Redeemer, it's pretty cool. He's down there now as a full-time youth minister, just a big tall white dude in Guatemala, sticks out like a sore thumb. When I say tall, he's like 6'7".
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's, I mean, my 5'2" self could not even imagine.
Yeah. But we were talking to him, like, dude, they really sing loud. He goes, you know what we did? He's like, we did a series called The Songs We Sing. And so they took the songs that we sing, like Jesus leaving the 99 to pursue the one. He's like, and we taught the stories. He said, some of these kids never knew the stories. So they're just singing a song. He leaves the 99 to the one, and that means nothing to him. He said, but after we taught the story, the next time they sang the song, he's like, they lit up. And so it's really cool to hear that. Like,
that's powerful.
But I think about like the lost sheep, and I cannot see the story of the lost sheep now without connecting it to the kids in Guatemala.
Wow, that's awesome.
Singing. So we got the trilogy. We got the rich ruler. So that's another big one. Zacchaeus.
The wee little man.
Wee little man, we'll see. That's like another story that blows my mind. Like, he's a tax collector, like he's basically collecting taxes from Rome, which enables Rome to continue to keep his people, Israel, enslaved. Like, not a dude.
No, not at all.
And Jesus is like, I'm going to be friends with that guy. Just showing that. Anything in those chapters stand out to you that you're like, hey, like this, like, because I was reading this is one nugget that just impacted me, that jumped out to me this time around in Luke.
Really, to me, I heard this one before, but like the 10 men with leprosy, when they call out and they're like, God, like save us, like heal us, and so God heals them, and then only one guy comes back and starts praising the Lord, and I love like when Jesus is like, your faith has healed you, like go in peace. And I'm like, wow, that's just such a powerful thing, to see like, and only one guy came back, like I would like to think that like, if I was healed, I would be the one, that went back, but like to think that 9 just walked away, but that one had so much faith, and the Lord's like, hey, that faith, like you were talking about earlier, like that faith is what matters. So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah. I was, for some reason this time around, I was struck by how much Jesus talks about money. Yeah. And someone was telling me that one of the reasons is because it creates a lightness to be just ready to be used by God anyway. Like so often our lack of activity for God is hindered by the control that money has over our lives.
Absolutely.
Whether it controls us for our status, like do I have the right clothes, the right car, the right neighborhood, whether it controls us for security, do I have enough for a rainy day, do I have enough for college, do I have enough for my kid, like whatever it is, like money controls us, which renders us inactive for the kingdom. Is like, but when you think about the generosity of the kingdom, like the more generous you are, the more freedom you have to then be used by God. But I loved in chapter 12 when Jesus talks about giving for the kingdom, he says like, go and sell what you have to give to those in need. And I think so often our mentality for giving is giving out of abundance. Like, well, I've got some left over. So, or like, let me give, it's like, these people, it's like they don't have the money to meet the need, therefore they have to sell what they have. Yeah, like that's giving not out of abundance, but giving out of scarcity, which I think is unique to the way that God's grace grips you.
It's just like a joyful heart behind it too. Like I'm going to do this because I want to give, instead of just like I need to, so I'm going to do this like little bit if I have it.
Yeah, that's good. Cool. So in this section, we see a lot of social outsiders being brought into God's kingdom. Like, so what are some of the social outsiders we see?
The diseased, the Samaritans, and the tax collectors.
Yeah. So and oftentimes it's like tax collectors are used synonymously with sinners. Yeah. The sinners and the tax, like I said, we're not thought well of. So then we get to the story of the prodigal son. And so when we're in that story and we think about God showing his grace to all these people that seemingly don't deserve it, and in the prodigal son, like, what does the oldest son do? How does he feel about his brother getting grace?
He's upset about it.
Yeah, he's like, this is ridiculous.
He actually like stays out in the field and is like sad about it.
Pouting.
Yeah, he's out there pouting.
And so what we see is like that's a picture of how so many people within Israel, especially the religious leaders, were responding to the outsiders and receiving grace. They're like who are they to receive this? And so it's like it's kind of this picture of this is how so many within Israel are responding to God's grace extended to those. But the truth is, like,
which is how Jonah responded to.
Yeah. There's another story of the sign of Jonah. That one, the sign of Jonah, makes multiple gospel accounts as well. Yeah. All right. So after chapter 19, what happens?
The rejection of Jesus and the resistance to Jesus really heats up.
So it's been like chapter 4, they're like, throw him off a mountain. But for
Yeah.
the most part, like there's been plots, but nothing really explicit. Now all of a sudden, the furnace is heating up. So chapters 20 through 24, it's the last 4 chapters. We get Jesus's final week in Jerusalem. Like I love Luke for Holy Week, and so it's a great thing to walk through. But the last week of his life is during which Old Testament festival?
Exodus.
Which is the remembrance. So what festival do they celebrate?
Oh, Passover. Yeah.
For Exodus. Yeah. And so that brings us back to the whole chapter 9 and what Jesus came to do, like the new Exodus. And so like it just comes full circle.
Yeah.
He sets his eyes to Jerusalem, a new Exodus, and the Exodus we have the Lamb of God. And so chapters 20 through 23 take us through Holy Week. And just I would say Luke's account pretty much parallels Mark's account, so we won't go into too many details on this. But when we get to chapter 24, like, so this is after Jesus has died.
Yep.
There's this road to Emmaus moment that I love.
Yeah.
And I would say, like, if I was thinking about what opened a key for me to have a more passionate love for the Old Testament, it would be Luke 24. Like, there's like a huge moment in my walk, probably in about 2008, where it was chapter 24 of Luke that launched me into not just the Old Testament, something I need to know, but the Old Testament, something I like want to know.
Oh, wow.
And so what happens in the road to Emmaus?
So 2 guys are walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus, and they're talking about everything that just happened, specifically Jesus' crucifixion.
Yeah. So do you know how far the road was? Do you remember that?
I don't remember how far it was.
7 miles.
Yeah.
Wow. Back in the day, there was a really popular thing on YouTube called sermon jams. Did you ever see those?
I don't think I did, no.
They take like a really powerful sermon and they'll reduce it to like a 5-minute video clip.
Oh, okay.
And they put like real cool music behind it. So it's like hip, and then they do graphics. And
That's awesome.
anyways, there was a sermon jam on a Matt Chandler sermon.
Oh, yeah.
On this, and he's like 7 miles, and he says 7 miles like 13 times, and so by the end of it, you're like 7 miles.
7 miles.
But he's like Jesus, like that's a long way to walk. He's like, have you ever stubbed your toe and tried to walk? He's like Jesus was just crucified.
Yeah,
he's walking 7 miles. Anyways, you'd have to listen to it. It's much funnier when he does it.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, so they're talking about all these things that just happened, specifically the crucifixion. All right, what else happens?
Jesus shows up, but they don't recognize him.
Yeah,
They're kept from recognizing
and
him.
what do they like? What do they say? They're like,
we thought Jesus was the one.
yeah, they're like we thought he was like. So they're sad.
We thought he was the one.
They're like, we went to Jerusalem. Like this dude, we thought he was going to show up and overthrow Rome, and start a new kingdom. He's going to be victorious. We're ready to go to arms. Like we're there because we're like, hey, if we need to fight to overthrow Rome, I'm in. And they killed that guy.
Yeah.
And so now they're like, we missed it. Like he's not. And so they're sitting there just sad, walking, and so Jesus tells them everything. He's like, hey, like, didn't the scripture say that everything that just happened had to happen? And so he's like, let me teach you.
Yeah.
All right. So read verse 27.
And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself.
So he's like, give me a Bible.
Yeah.
Yeah. They didn't have Bibles. They had scrolls. Like,
Yeah.
But he's
Rolling
like,
it
let me let's start with Moses, okay, who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. He's like, let's start with the first 5 books of the Bible, then we'll get into the prophets and the writings. Like, he's like, I want to show you how this is all about Jesus.
Yeah.
And so then after he teaches them, which must have been the best Bible study ever.
Yeah.
Right?
For real.
Like, how much better did he get from 12?
Yeah.
Like the 12-year-old Jesus, 33 now, like he's even better at teaching the Bible. He acts like he's going further. He's like, oh, you guys, like, my journey goes past Emmaus. I got to keep going. And they're like, no, like, have dinner with us. Yep. And so Jesus at dinner, he breaks bread, and what happens?
Their eyes are open, and then he completely vanishes.
Yeah, they're like, did our hearts stop burning within us? Like, when that dude was teaching the Bible, it felt like it had some authority behind it, you know?
Yeah.
And they're like, was our heart not burning within us? And Jesus is like, whew.
Yeah, which is wild, like, to think about, like, just sitting there and like.
And I love how like he also like shows up again, like just walks through walls.
Oh yeah,
peace be with you. So he's like, whoa!
It's like Jesus is pretty cool. Like, I mean, he does things like that all the time, and you're like, wait a minute,
it's crazy stuff. All right, so verses 27 and 44, you know, about how all of Scripture is ultimately about Jesus. brings us back to chapter 1, verse 1 with that word accomplished, which means to fulfill. So it's basically saying like, hey, this book starts off saying, I want to show you how Jesus fulfills everything the Old Testament has pointed to. Then it ends with Jesus saying like, hey, let's look at the whole Old Testament. I want to show you how it's all fulfilled in me. And so I love that. So this is like I said, this is huge for us when it comes to reading scripture. It's really a turning point in my own personal journey for falling in love with the Old Testament. So we can read the Bible and basically in two different ways. And so one way that we read it is the Bible is primarily about us. So we come to stories like David and Goliath, and what's the lesson?
What's the giant in your life that you need to slay?
Yeah, it's a great sermon, right? Like, who doesn't have a giant in their life to kill? Oh, yeah. Not like a literal.
I don't know.
You're like Jeff from 5'2".
Everyone's a giant.
Hey, hopefully Carter didn't make you mad this week. It's biblical. But if we read it primarily about us, the Bible becomes about like what we need to do. And so what do we look for?
Moral lessons to live out, things to do, things not to do, heroes to follow, anything like that.
Yeah, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so, but what Jesus shows us in chapter 24 is the Bible isn't primarily about us. It's primarily about Jesus. And so the Bible is for us, but it's not about us.
Yeah.
And so the Bible isn't primarily about what we need to do. It's primarily about Jesus and what he came to do.
Yeah, it's about Jesus and what he's done.
Yeah. And so, like, I don't want to get in trouble for plagiarism here. But if you go to YouTube and search Tim Keller's just what's the Bible about, it's just this awesome video where he goes through and shows like how everything in the Old Testament, Jesus is the true and better Abraham. Jesus is the true and better sacrificial lamb. Jesus is the true and better temple, the true and better rock, the true and better David, the true and better. And it's like, and afterwards you walk out, it's like maybe a 5-minute video. And afterwards you're going, wow, everything's about Jesus. Like I just needed someone to help connect the dots. So do yourself a favor. After reading Luke 24, verse 27, go watch that video.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Carter.
Yeah, Carter, can you put that in the notes?
Show notes. Let's see this. All right, Carter. So we're going to put that in the show notes for you guys. Any concluding thoughts?
No.
Right. Thanks for joining.
It's fun.
Thanks for hanging out.
First podcast.
Yeah, and you did great.
It was a lot of fun.
You're going to be back. You're going to come back on, I promise.
Awesome.
Luke is written in 2 parts. Part 1 is the gospel according to Luke, and part 2 is the whole book of Acts. So we're going to talk about Acts next time we hop on here. So thanks for joining.
Awesome.
And we'll be back in 2 weeks. So see you guys then.